The sun had just begun to rise over the small-town railway station. A cool breeze swept across the dusty ground, carrying the scent of coal and iron from the engines that rested on the tracks. Jack, a cowboy with a weathered face and steady eyes, walked slowly toward the platform. He carried a small bag slung across his shoulder and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded him from the early rays of sunlight. He had spent weeks away from home, selling cattle at the market and running errands that were part of his simple but hard-working life. Now he was on his way back to the ranch, hoping for some rest before the next season's work began. The station was already crowded with people, some rushing, some waiting. Families carried baskets, children clung to their mothers, and businessmen tapped their shoes impatiently. Jack walked with calm steps, never rushing like the others. He had learned that life, no matter how fast it seemed, always gave moments to those who knew how to wait. As he approached the ticket counter, his eyes caught sight of an old man standing in front of the clerk. The man's shoulders were bent, his back slightly curved from age. His clothes were neat but worn, showing signs of long years of use. He held out a few coins in his shaking hand, his voice low and almost pleading as he asked for a ticket. The clerk, a young man with sharp features and little patience, frowned and tapped his fingers on the wooden counter. "That's not enough," he said firmly. "You need more money if you want this ticket." The old man's face fell. He counted the coins again, as if hoping they would magically increase in number. His lips trembled as he whispered, "This is all I have. I just need to get home. My family is waiting." The line behind him grew restless. A woman sighed loudly, muttering about being late. Another man tapped his shoe and shook his head in irritation. People began to whisper, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and annoyance. The old man's ears caught every sound and his face turned red with shame. He stepped aside, still clutching the coins, not knowing what else to do. Jack watched the scene quietly. Something stirred in his heart. He had grown up seeing hardship and knew what it felt like to stand helpless while others looked on. His father used to say, "Son, if you ever see someone struggling and you can help, don't think twice. Help them. You may forget the act, but they will never forget your kindness." Without a word, Jack stepped forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, placing them on the counter. The clerk looked up in surprise. "That's enough for the ticket," Jack said calmly. "Give it to him." The clerk hesitated for a moment, then shrugged and handed the ticket to the old man. The old man stared at Jack, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Young man, I don't even know what to say," he stammered. His voice broke with emotion. "You didn't have to." Jack gave a small smile and shook his head. "Don't worry about it, sir. Just take your ticket and travel safe." The old man's eyes glistened with tears. He clutched the ticket tightly as if it were the most precious thing he had ever received. He tried to hand the coins back to Jack, but Jack raised his hand gently. "Keep them. You'll need them more than I do." The old man's lips quivered. He wanted to say more, but no words came. He placed his hand on Jack's arm and gave it a grateful squeeze. Jack nodded and stepped back, not wanting to make the man feel more embarrassed. The people in line had fallen silent for a moment. Some looked away, ashamed of their earlier impatience. A few even smiled faintly at Jack, but he paid them no attention. To him, it was nothing more than a simple act of decency. Jack walked toward a wooden bench and sat down, setting his bag beside him. He pulled his hat lower over his face, trying to rest while waiting for the train. The sound of footsteps, chatter, and the occasional whistle of steam filled the air. He leaned back, his mind drifting to thoughts of home, of the horses in the corral and the quiet nights under the stars. But his peace was soon interrupted. He heard the shuffling of shoes and a faint cough. He opened one eye and saw the old man walking toward him. "May I sit here?" the old man asked softly. Jack shifted his bag and gestured to the empty space. "Of course." The old man lowered himself carefully onto the bench, his hands resting on his knees. For a moment he said nothing, only gazing at the people rushing by. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying both gratitude and humility. "I don't know your name, son, but I will never forget your face. In this world, kindness is rare. You gave me more than a ticket, you gave me dignity." Jack tilted his head slightly, uncomfortable with praise. "It was nothing, sir. Anyone would have done the same." The old man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, not anyone. Most people just looked at me like I was a burden, but you stepped forward when you didn't have to. That tells me something about the kind of man you are." Jack remained quiet. He wasn't used to talking about himself, and he didn't see the need to. He had done what he felt was right, and that was enough. The minutes passed slowly. The station grew louder as more passengers arrived. Vendors shouted their offers of tea and snacks. Children laughed and cried, and the whistle of the approaching train echoed across the platform. Jack adjusted his hat again, ready for the journey ahead. He didn't know that fate had already set a plan in motion. What he thought was just a simple act of kindness was about to open a door to something far greater than he could have imagined, for in just a few minutes 2 figures would appear at the station, figures that would change the course of his life forever. But for now, Jack sat quietly, a cowboy at rest, unaware of the extraordinary story that was about to unfold. The train whistle echoed through the air, louder this time, shaking the quiet thoughts that hung over the platform. People began moving quickly, gathering their bags and adjusting their coats as the black engine rolled in with a hiss of steam. Jack stood from the bench, picking up his bag and helping the old man to his feet. The man's fingers still clutched the ticket Jack had bought for him, as though letting go of it might make it disappear. They walked slowly toward the platform edge. The old man moved carefully, his steps steady but slow. Jack kept by his side without saying a word. The crowd surged around them, but Jack made sure the old man didn't get pushed or hurried. The train finally screeched to a stop. People poured out of the doors while others hurried to get in. The conductor's voice rang out, calling for order, but the noise was too loud for anyone to truly listen. Jack guided the old man toward one of the carriages and helped him climb the narrow steps. Once inside, they found a spot near the window where the old man could sit comfortably. Jack set his own bag on the overhead rack and leaned against the wall, watching the passengers shuffle about. It was then that he heard hurried footsteps outside, light but determined, almost musical against the stone floor of the platform. He turned his head slightly and saw 2 young women moving quickly through the crowd. Their hair glistened in the morning light, their clothes crisp and neat as though they had just stepped out of a fine home. One carried a small handbag, the other held a folded shawl. Their eyes scanned the crowd with urgency until they spotted the old man through the train window. "Father," one of them called, her voice rising above the noise. The old man turned sharply, his eyes widening in surprise and joy. "My daughters!" he exclaimed, his trembling hands pressing against the glass as though to reach for them. Jack looked from the old man to the young women. They were not just beautiful but graceful, carrying themselves with a dignity that drew everyone's attention. Passengers nearby paused to watch, whispering quietly. Few could hide their surprise that the tired old man was the father of such elegant daughters. The train door opened, and the young women rushed in, weaving through the narrow aisle until they reached him. They embraced him tightly, their voices filled with relief. "We were so worried when you left without telling us," one said, tears shining in her eyes. The other pressed her cheek against his shoulder, whispering, "Thank God we found you." The old man smiled weakly, still overwhelmed by their presence. He stroked their hair with shaky hands as though afraid they might vanish if he let go. "I didn't want to trouble you," he said softly. "I thought I could manage the journey myself." The daughters pulled back slightly, their eyes filled with both love and gentle reproach. "You should have told us. We would have taken care of everything," the elder daughter said. Then, almost at the same moment, both noticed Jack standing nearby. Their eyes lingered on him, curious, almost questioning. Jack tipped his hat politely, not wanting to intrude on the family's moment. The old man quickly explained, his voice carrying pride. "This young man helped me when I didn't have enough for the ticket. If not for him, I wouldn't even be on this train." The daughters' expressions changed instantly. They looked at Jack with warmth and gratitude, their eyes softening. The younger daughter stepped forward first. "You helped our father?" she asked gently. Jack nodded modestly. "It was nothing. Anyone would have done it." But the elder daughter shook her head firmly. "No, not anyone." People stood around and no one moved. "You did. That means everything to us." Her voice was calm but full of feeling. Jack felt a little uncomfortable under their gaze. He wasn't used to such attention. In his world, kindness was just part of life. It didn't call for thanks or admiration. Yet something in their eyes made him feel different, almost seen in a way he wasn't used to. The old man gestured toward the empty seats beside him. "Please sit down with us," he urged Jack. "I want my daughters to know the man who helped me today." At first, Jack hesitated. He had planned to keep to himself during the journey, but refusing would seem rude. So he lowered himself onto the seat across from them. his hands resting on his knees. The train began to move, jerking forward before settling into a steady rhythm. Outside the window, the scenery shifted. Fields of green stretched into the distance, dotted with trees swaying in the morning wind. Inside the carriage, the noise of chatter filled the air, but for Jack, time seemed to slow. The daughters sat close to their father, one holding his arm, the other adjusting his coat. Their care for him was obvious, every small gesture filled with tenderness. Jack watched quietly, reminded of his own mother who used to fuss over his father in the same way before she passed away. The sight stirred memories he rarely allowed himself to dwell on. After a while, the younger daughter spoke again, her voice curious. "What's your name?" "Jack," he answered simply. "And where are you from, Jack?" the elder asked. Jack shifted slightly, not one for long explanations. "I work on a ranch outside of town. Been raising cattle most of my life. Simple work, but it keeps me busy." The younger daughter smiled softly. "Simple work, maybe, but not simple character. You showed us today what kind of man you are." Jack lowered his eyes, brushing off the compliment, but inside he felt a quiet warmth. It wasn't often that strangers noticed his worth. The old man leaned back against the seat, his eyes drifting between Jack and his daughters. He said little, but his expression showed deep thought, as though he was seeing something none of them yet understood. The train rocked gently, carrying them farther along their journey. Passengers came and went through the aisles, some glancing at the little group curiously, others too lost in their own lives to notice. But for Jack, the moment was far from ordinary. He had stepped forward to help an old man, never expecting anything in return. Yet here he was, sitting with a family who looked at him not as a stranger, but as someone who had touched their lives. As the morning turned into noon, the light streaming through the windows grew brighter. The daughters asked more questions, eager to know about the cowboy who had shown kindness when no one else did. Jack answered simply, never embellishing, never boasting. He spoke of the open land, of horses and long rides, of the quiet nights when the stars stretched endlessly above him. The daughters listened with genuine interest, their eyes shining. For them, raised in a more polished world of towns and education, his stories carried a raw beauty. There was honesty in his words, a strength in his simplicity that was more impressive than any grand tale. The old man watched closely, his heart swelling with pride, not just for his daughters, but for the stranger who had stepped into their lives in such an unexpected way. The train continued on, but Jack could not shake the thought that something unusual had begun that morning. He had not sought it, nor had he planned it, but fate seemed to have placed him on a path that was no longer just his own. And as the scenery rushed by, the feeling only grew stronger, as though the train carried not just passengers, but a story that was only beginning to unfold. The train moved steadily across the wide countryside, its wheels clattering against the tracks like a steady heartbeat. The sun had risen higher, casting golden light through the windows and filling the carriage with warmth. Jack sat quietly across from the old man and his daughters, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He was a man of few words, never one to boast or fill silence with empty chatter. Yet he felt the curious eyes of the two young women on him from time to time, as though they were trying to understand the man who had stepped forward for their father when no one else would. The old man shifted in his seat, adjusting his coat, and smiled warmly at Jack. "Son," he said, his voice rough with age but steady, "you have done me a kindness today, and I would not feel right if you left this train without sharing a meal with us. It is a small way for us to show our gratitude." Jack shook his head lightly. "You don't owe me anything, sir. I just helped where I could." But the old man's eyes grew serious. "It is not about owing. It is about respect. You treated me with dignity when others looked away. My daughters and I would be honored if you joined us." The daughters nodded quickly in agreement. The younger one leaned forward, her voice gentle but insistent. "Please do. It would mean much to our father and to us." Jack hesitated for a moment. He wasn't a man used to invitations or being treated as a guest. His life was simple. Eat when hungry, sleep when tired, work when there was work. But something in the sincerity of their faces made it hard to refuse. Finally, he gave a small nod. "All right then. I'll accept your kindness." The daughters smiled, their eyes bright, and the old man's shoulders seemed to relax with relief. For a moment, the world outside, the rolling fields, the villages in the distance seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet connection forming inside the carriage. As the train rolled on, the conversation grew naturally. The younger daughter asked about Jack's life on the ranch. He answered in his plain way, painting a picture of early mornings when the air was crisp and the horses stirred restlessly in their stalls. He spoke of long rides across open land, of the sun rising behind him as the herd moved slowly forward. He described the hard days when storms rolled in and he had to fight to keep the cattle safe, and the quiet nights when the stars lit up the sky so brightly it seemed like heaven itself had bent down to touch the earth. The daughters listened closely, their faces glowing with interest. To them, raised with books and city manners, his world sounded raw and powerful, free in ways they had only dreamed of. The elder daughter asked questions about the horses, about the ranch, about the people he worked with. Jack answered patiently, his voice steady, his words plain but honest. He had never thought of his life as anything special, but the way they listened made him feel as though his stories carried weight. The old man leaned back, watching the exchange with a thoughtful smile. Every so often he added a word of encouragement or nodded as if to himself. He had raised his daughters to value character over wealth, honesty over fine words, and here before him was a man who lived those values without even realizing it. At one point, the younger daughter laughed softly when Jack described how a stubborn horse once refused to move for hours, forcing him to sit under the hot sun until it finally decided to walk again. "It sounds as if the horse was testing your patience," she teased. Jack smiled faintly. "Maybe it was, but patience is part of the work. You can't force an animal. You earn its trust step by step." Her laughter faded into a thoughtful look. "That's true for people too, isn't it? Trust has to be earned." Jack nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly before he looked away. Her words lingered in his mind longer than he expected. The train swayed gently, the rhythm of the wheels filling the moments of silence between their words. Outside, the fields gave way to forests, then to rivers that gleamed like silver under the sun. The journey stretched on, but none of them seemed eager for it to end. After some time, the elder daughter shared a bit of their own story. She explained that she and her sister had studied in the city, pursuing knowledge and preparing for lives that stretched beyond the quiet village where they were born. Their father, she said, had stayed behind to manage the family land and affairs. "He has always carried more on his shoulders than he should," she added softly, glancing at the old man with deep affection. The old man chuckled, shaking his head. "And yet I still thought I could travel alone without telling anyone. Foolish of me." The younger daughter placed her hand gently on his. "Not foolish, father, just stubborn. But now we are here, and we will not let you out of our sight again." Jack watched this quiet exchange, feeling a deep respect for the bond between them. He had seen many families broken by hardship, by pride, by distance. But here was love, strong and steady, tying them together even when mistakes were made. Hours passed and the train continued its journey. Vendors moved through the aisles offering tea and snacks. Jack bought some tea for the old man, placing the warm cup carefully in his hands. The old man's eyes softened as though touched by yet another small kindness. As the sun began to tilt toward the afternoon, the old man leaned forward, his voice lower now, carrying a note of seriousness. "Jack," he said, "a man's character shows in the way he treats those who can give him nothing in return. You gave freely, without asking for reward. That is something rare." Jack shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with such direct praise. "I only did what anyone should have done." The elder daughter smiled gently. "But you did it when no one else did. That makes all the difference." The carriage grew quieter as the train rolled on, the noise of other passengers fading into the background. For Jack, time seemed to stretch. He hadn't asked for any of this, yet here he was, drawn into the heart of a family that treated him not as a stranger, but as someone who mattered. The old man leaned back, closing his eyes briefly as though resting. The daughters sat close to him, their presence protective and loving. Jack sat across from them, his mind filled with thoughts he could not quite name. He had lived a life of routine, his days shaped by work and solitude. Yet now, for the first time in a long while, he felt as though something larger was stirring, something he could not yet see, but could feel in the quiet rhythm of his heart. Outside the window, the train moved steadily forward, carrying them all toward a destination none of them fully understood. But inside that carriage, a bond had begun to form, one that would change the course of their lives forever. The train rocked gently as it moved deeper into the countryside. The rhythm of the wheels created a steady song that filled the air. Jack sat with his hat resting on his knee, his eyes scanning the carriage. The old man had dozed off lightly, leaning against the window while his daughters sat close, speaking to each other in soft voices. Jack was quiet, but his senses were always alert. Life on the ranch had taught him to stay watchful. The peace of the journey did not last long. At the far end of the carriage, a group of rowdy men stumbled in. Their clothes were dusty, their voices loud, and their manners rough. They carried the smell of cheap drink and swaggered down the aisle as though the train belonged to them. Passengers shrank back into their seats, avoiding their eyes, hoping not to draw attention. Jack noticed them immediately. His jaw tightened. He had seen men like this before, men who thrived on making others uncomfortable, men who tested boundaries just to see how far they could go. One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, spotted the old man's seat. He grinned and nudged his companion. "Look at that. A fine spot by the window. Old man, move aside. We'll be taking this seat now." The old man stirred from his light sleep, blinking in confusion. "I beg your pardon?" he asked softly, his voice weak. The man's grin widened, but it held no warmth. "I said move. You can sit somewhere else." The daughters instantly stiffened, their hands gripping their father's arms protectively. "He's sitting here," the elder daughter said firmly, her voice steady though her eyes betrayed a hint of fear. "There are plenty of other seats," the man laughed harshly. "I don't care for the other seats. I want this one." His companions chuckled, standing behind him like shadows ready to cause trouble. Before the old man could answer, Jack rose slowly to his feet. He set his hat back on his head, his tall frame casting a quiet shadow over the rowdy men. His eyes, calm yet unyielding, locked onto theirs. "This seat's taken," Jack said, his voice low but firm. The men turned their attention to him, sizing him up. The tall one sneered. "And who are you to say so?" Jack didn't flinch. "Doesn't matter who I am. What matters is this man isn't moving. Find another place." A tense silence spread through the carriage. Passengers held their breath, watching the standoff. The old man's daughters looked at Jack with wide eyes, torn between fear and admiration. The old man himself sat frozen, his lips pressed tight, knowing trouble was at hand. The tall man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can tell me what to do, cowboy?" Jack's hand rested calmly on the back of the seat, his body relaxed yet ready. His voice remained steady. "I don't think I know. Now walk away." For a moment the air was heavy with the threat of violence. But there was something in Jack's stance, in the quiet confidence of a man who had faced storms, wild horses, and worse, that made the rowdy men hesitate. They had expected fear, maybe pleading, but not calm defiance. The tall man spat on the floor, scowled, and turned abruptly. "Not worth our time," he muttered, waving his hand at his companions. With grumbles and curses, they moved down the carriage, searching for easier prey. A collective sigh of relief spread through the passengers. Some nodded at Jack, silent gratitude in their eyes. The daughters exhaled deeply, their shoulders relaxing. The younger one whispered, "Thank you," her voice trembling with emotion. Jack gave a small nod, then sat back down as if nothing had happened. His heart was steady, his expression unchanged. For him, standing up for what was right was as natural as breathing. The old man placed a hand over Jack's arm, his voice heavy with feeling. "Son, you have done more for me today than I can ever repay. You gave me dignity at the ticket counter, and now you've given me safety before my daughters. You are a rare man." Jack lowered his eyes, uncomfortable with praise. "I just did what needed doing," he replied simply. But the daughters could not hide their admiration. The elder looked at him with newfound respect, while the younger's eyes shone with something softer, something that lingered. The train continued on, but the mood inside the carriage had changed. Passengers spoke in low voices, sharing quiet remarks about the cowboy who had stood his ground. Some even smiled at him as they passed, tipping their heads in thanks. Jack acknowledged them with a small nod but said nothing more. The old man leaned back, watching Jack with thoughtful eyes. He spoke after a long pause. "Tell me, Jack, do you have family of your own?" Jack hesitated before answering. "No, sir. My folks passed on some years ago. It's just me now working the land, keeping the ranch running." The old man nodded slowly, his gaze deep. A man without family often carries burdens in silence. "But today you carried mine. That tells me what kind of heart you have." The daughters listened intently, their expressions softening further. The elder daughter said gently, "Not everyone would risk themselves for strangers." "You did, and we won't forget it." Jack shifted uncomfortably, unused to such words. He looked out the window, where fields stretched endlessly golden in the late afternoon sun. Inside, though, he felt a quiet stirring, a warmth he hadn't known in years. The train journey stretched on, and the family spoke more with him. The daughters asked about the ranch, about the stars he saw at night, about the freedom of wide-open spaces. Jack answered with simple honesty, and every word seemed to draw them closer. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and red, the old man spoke again. "Jack, I believe God places people in our paths for a reason. You did not just help me today, you showed my daughters what true character looks like. For that, you will always be welcome in our home." Jack met his eyes for a long moment. There was no pride in the old man's words, only truth. Jack gave a small nod, touched in a way he could not express. The daughters exchanged glances, their eyes shining with unspoken feelings. They had started the day rushing to protect their father, but by evening, it was the cowboy who had protected them all. The train pressed forward into the deepening night, carrying them closer to their destination. For Jack, it carried something else too, a sense that his life, once simple and solitary, was beginning to take a turn he had never imagined. The train slowed as it approached the final station, its wheels screeching softly against the rails. The lights of the town ahead glowed warmly in the evening dusk, casting golden reflections against the windows. Passengers began to stir, gathering their belongings, stretching their arms after the long journey. The old man, now fully awake, looked out of the window with tired but content eyes. Beside him, his daughters sat close, their presence steady and comforting. Jack stood quietly, reaching up to take down his small bag from the overhead rack. He had intended to say farewell at the station, to slip away into the evening without fuss. But fate had other plans, and the old man's hand reached out to stop him. "Son," the old man said firmly, "you must come with us, at least for tonight. You've done too much for me to let you walk away without a meal under my roof." Jack shook his head lightly, adjusting his hat. "I don't want to trouble you. You've got your family here. That's enough." The younger daughter leaned forward, her eyes wide with insistence. "It wouldn't be trouble. It would be a kindness to us. Please come." The elder daughter added softly, "Our father means what he says." "You are welcome truly." Jack hesitated. He wasn't used to invitations, wasn't used to being drawn into other people's lives. But the sincerity in their voices, the look in their eyes, made it difficult to refuse. Finally, he gave a small nod. "All right, just for tonight." The old man smiled broadly, his face lighting with relief. "Good, then it's settled." The train pulled into the station with a long whistle. The platform was busy with people reuniting with loved ones, voices rising in laughter and greetings. Jack stepped down first, helping the old man carefully onto the platform. The daughters followed, their graceful movements catching the attention of more than a few passers-by. Waiting nearby was a carriage, sturdy and well-kept, with a driver holding the reins of 2 strong horses. The old man gestured proudly. "This will take us home." Jack was surprised but said nothing as they climbed into the carriage. He had expected a modest house, perhaps a simple farm, but the presence of a driver and fine horses hinted at something larger. The ride was long, the town giving way to rolling fields, then to quiet country roads lined with tall trees. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of earth and wildflowers. The daughters spoke softly with their father, while Jack sat silently watching the changing scenery. The old man, however, would glance at him from time to time, his expression thoughtful, almost measuring. At last, the carriage turned through a wide gate and rolled down a long driveway. Jack's eyes widened as he saw the house that rose before them. It was no small cottage, it was a grand estate, its walls tall and solid, its windows glowing with warm light. The land around it stretched wide, dotted with barns and smaller houses for workers. Horses grazed in fenced pastures, and the sound of dogs barking echoed in the distance. Jack felt a wave of surprise wash over him. He had helped the old man without knowing anything of his background, without imagining he belonged to such a place. The old man noticed his expression and chuckled softly. "You didn't know, did you? This is my home and these are my lands. But today at the station, none of that mattered. I was just an old man without enough for a ticket. And you treated me with kindness when you didn't know who I was. Jack lowered his head slightly, his voice steady. Didn't matter who you were. You needed help, that's all I saw. The old man's eyes softened with respect, and that is why I wanted you here. Servants greeted them as they stepped down from the carriage. The daughters led their father inside while Jack followed quietly, feeling out of place in the grand halls. The floors were polished wood, the walls decorated with paintings of ancestors and landscapes. Yet the warmth of the family's presence made the house feel less like a show of wealth and more like a true home. They guided Jack into a large dining room where a meal had been prepared. The table was set with care, roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables, and fruit. Jack, unused to such richness, felt almost uncomfortable, but the old man insisted he sit at the table as a guest of honor. Throughout the meal, the conversation flowed easily. The daughters asked more about his life, their curiosity endless. Jack answered in his plain way, never exaggerating, never pretending to be more than he was. His honesty seemed to impress them more than fine words ever could. The old man listened, his expression calm but full of thought, as though every answer revealed more about Jack's character. When the meal ended, they moved to a sitting room where the fire crackled warmly. The old man leaned forward in his chair, his daughters seated close by. He looked at Jack with steady eyes. "Son," he said slowly, "I want to tell you something. When you helped me today, you did not know who I was nor what I had. You simply saw a man in need and stepped forward. That is rare. Too many judge worth by wealth, by titles, by what a man can offer in return. But you saw none of that. You gave freely." Jack shifted in his seat, his hands resting on his knees. "I didn't do it for reward. I just did what was right." The old man nodded firmly. "And that is exactly why it matters. A man like you, honest, steady, brave, is worth more than riches." His gaze shifted briefly toward his daughters before returning to Jack. "My family is dear to me. They are my pride. And I'm glad they saw your kindness with their own eyes." The daughters exchanged quiet glances, their cheeks faintly flushed, their eyes shining with admiration. Jack felt the weight of their gaze but said nothing, his silence more eloquent than words. As the night grew late, the old man stood slowly, leaning on his cane. "You are welcome here any time, Jack. This home will always have a place for you." Jack rose respectfully, tipping his hat slightly. "Thank you, sir. That means more than I can say." The younger daughter walked with him toward the door as he prepared to leave for the guest room they had offered him for the night. She paused, her voice soft, almost uncertain. "We're glad you were there today. Things could have been very different without you." Jack looked at her, his expression calm but kind. "Sometimes we're put where we're meant to be. Maybe today was one of those times." Her smile was gentle, her eyes holding his for a long moment before she turned away. That night, as Jack lay in the guest room, staring at the wooden beams above him, he thought about the day's events. He had started his morning as a lone cowboy, just another traveler heading home. Yet by a simple act of kindness, he had stepped into the life of a family he never expected to meet. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he felt certain of one thing. This was not the end of the story. For somewhere deep inside, he sensed that the bond formed on that train, under such ordinary circumstances, would change the path of his life forever.